A question came in via email asking if we can talk about this idea of following the child, which is kind of the cornerstone of Montessori, right? We always hear, oh, Montessori is all about following the child. Well, but what does that mean? So following the child is, so when Dr. Montessori said follow the child, that is not the complete sentence or idea, right? What she was referring to is follow the child's development. Now, there's a couple of kind of funny takes on this whole follow the child thing. One is follow the child, but follow as their leader. So that means being that prepared adult that is educated on what the child needs and is able to support them. So follow as the child's leader. And then another one is follow the child, but not off a cliff, right? So we're not following the child by doing whatever the child wants, because as Dr. Montessori said, I'm paraphrasing here, they can get lost in a sea of, information and cultural nonsense, and we see it in our daily lives, right? And so our job is to curate our environment, our homeschool experience, so that we can follow the child's development, we can follow their needs, but not follow them off a cliff. So, and yes, we do need to follow their interests, right? That is a pillar, is following their interests. And their interest at first might look like nothing related to Montessori, right? And so our job is to start where the children are at, and then slowly observe how they're working, what they're curious about, how they're engaging with what they're curious about, and start making connections to the real world. So for example, a child might be very interested in something like Pokemon, right? Which they're like, okay, what does that have to do with Montessori? But if we are following that child's interest, then eventually Pokemon might lead to drawing, which will lead to shapes, which will lead to geometry, right? Or Pokemon might lead to books, which might lead to connection to Japan, because some of the books are written in Japanese that they might find in the library, which might lead to an interest in Japan. Or it might lead to a variety of things, such as like, how did they come up with names? Let's come up with our own names. Let's create our own characters. So we really shouldn't freak out if our child comes to us or presents with this interest that doesn't seem to be related to anything academic, anything cultural, anything that we are comfortable with, right? And so that's where we need to follow into that experience. And one thing that I learned when I started homeschooling was that if we take the time to play with our children, to sit down and immerse ourselves in what they're curious about, then not only are we going to start seeing those interests from a different perspective, but we're also going to start establishing a different type of relationship with our child, where our child knows that we're receptive to their interests. And so then they become more receptive to what we have to offer, right? So that relationship is key. And that's why we start by following their interests, because there will be no academic work, there will be no self-discipline unless the child feels known, they feel seen, they feel accepted for who they are and what they are passionate about. Now, really quickly, let's talk about different types of needs, right? So following the child's needs, well, what is that? So there are skill-based needs. So for example, there might be, my child might need to learn how to tell time, right? That is a skill that I've noticed that my child needs. And then now I need to go and look, what are the lessons, what are the materials, what are the activities that will help me support that child's need that I've observed that they have. It might be executive function skills, for example. So, oh my gosh, my child is a mess. They lose their pencils and papers and everything. What are the executive function skills that they need to be more organized and able to manage themselves, right? And so then you need to take a look at your environment. How can I structure my environment? How can I scaffold my child's needs so that they develop these executive function skills? It might be emotional skills that they need. So for example, if a child is very overreactive and they get angry anytime they make a mistake, okay, well, that is identifying that they have a need to figure out how to express themselves, figure out how to manage that emotion, how to identify it, figure out what's behind it, and shift the child's mindset when it comes to making mistakes, for example. So that is an emotional need that we're identifying and then taking the necessary steps to meet. And I know this is very kind of big picture, and every single one of these little aspects could be a whole topic that we dive into. But I'm glad this came up because this gives us the big picture to start with. And then in subsequent conversations and in the Facebook group, we can start kind of dissecting each one. Now, a very important type of need, which is the one that sets Montessori apart, is developmental needs, right? So following the child's developmental needs. Well, what are those? So those are what in Montessori we call the sensitive periods and the human tendencies, right? So in the primary years, the sensitive period. So what are sensitive periods, first of all? They are moments in a child's life, so periods in a child's life, where they are driven to focus very intently on a particular type of activity or a particular area of exploration, right? So the reason that they have these sensitive periods, these drives, is because those drives are allowing the brain to form different parts of itself. And so the brain drives the child to engage in these activities in order to create those different centers of the brain. So for example, in the first plane, if you have a 3 to 6-year-old, their sensitive periods are going to be language, the refinement of language. So a 0 to 3-year-old is developing language. A 3 to 6-year-old is refining language, right? And so you can think, okay, my child is in this sensitive period. How can I help them refine their language? And that's why in the Montessori curriculum, in the lessons, you'll see all of these activities for example, in sensorial materials, giving all the language for all the sensorial materials. In language, doing all the 3-part cards and classifying different types of cats or dogs or whatever. That's because we are addressing that child's developmental need. So in the first plane, really quickly, it's refinement of language for 3 to 6-year-olds, mostly we're talking about refinement of language, refinement of the senses. So being able to, distinguish, with sight, with sense of touch, etc. So that's why we have those little sensorial activities. So senses, language, order. Order is really important for the first plane child. And so making sure that their environment is orderly, that their routine is orderly, and the refinement of movement, right? And so giving the child activities where they can carry things that they have to be careful with, like that walking on the line activity. But you can also do that outdoors, right? Like skipping over log stumps, for example, or walking carefully on ice, or just anything that the child will be invited to regulate their bodies. So there's lots of activities for that. So those are the sensitive periods in the first plane. In the second plane, and we're going to dive into these deeper later on in the year and in the group and in the hub, but I just want to give you an overview so you can start thinking about this in terms of following the child's developmental needs, not just academic needs. And in the second plane of development, the sensitive periods are imagination. So that's why we tell stories and we have these beautiful pictures for them to start imagining. It is the sensitive period for culture and knowledge. So that's why we tell stories and give children information about history in the past and how things are made, because that's what they want to know about. We answer their questions. There's also the sensitivity for morality in the second plane. And that means that the child is really interested in right versus wrong, in justice and equality. Are things equal? Are things fair? What does that look like? So we give a lot of opportunities for that in the second plane. And we notice when those things come up, when a child is saying, well, that's not fair, we don't dismiss it, right? We talk about it. What doesn't seem fair to you? Tell me more about that. So we bring that up. That's how we're following that child's need. And then finally is the sensitivity for abstraction. Now, what does that mean? So you will start to notice in your second plane child that their brain starts going faster than their hands. So if they're using bead bars, for example, I just posted on Instagram a good example. My daughter was counting bead bars to make the squares of numbers, but instead of counting bead by bead, she was holding the bead bars, but she was skip counting in her head. And so she was going 7, 14, 21. And so she was moving towards not needing the material anymore, but the material still gave her that concrete tool that she needed to make that leap into abstraction, right? So that's what you start seeing in the second plane. And so how do you meet that need? Well, by not forcing the child to use the material when they start moving away from it, right? So if I had told my daughter, well, no, you have to count every single bead, that would be kind of forcing her to stay in a very concrete stage when her brain wants to move towards abstraction. So those are the sensitive periods in the second plane. And when you do all this, which, obviously takes time, but I think that you can, certainly start noticing these things. Once you become aware of these concepts, then you start to notice them. And when you start to notice them, then you're able to start supporting them. That's why we're talking about this. And when you start noticing them, What you're doing is supporting their development and making your teaching life easier. Because when you are able to teach to the sensitive periods, right, then the child is so much more receptive because the brain is saying, yes, this is what I need in order to develop myself. And so then things just start to flow. And just a very quick final example is if you have second plane children, do we tell a story? Do we start by telling a story, or do we just start by pulling out three-part cards? If it were a primary children, we would go straight to the three-part cards. Why? Because they want order, right? And they want language. They want to learn all those words, and they like having that order in front of them. The second plane child no longer wants to have that order in front of them. They don't care about that external order anymore. It's already internalized. What they want is to be inspired so that their imagination can be kindled. And so what we do is before we start with the three-part cards, we tell a story, we have a conversation, we engage them, we ask them questions, we let them ask questions. And then once we bring out those three-part cards, the child is engaged because those pictures jump out at them and those words and those sentences make sense to them and are interesting because we've kindled their imagination. So that's how you use the sensitive periods to your advantage and to support the child and to make things easier for yourself, honestly, and to help the child get the most out of those materials.